Salutations. Few generals can be said to rival Alexander the Great, Hannibal, or Napoleon in the pantheon of military greatness. However, one such general is Gaius Julius Caesar. In this video, we will be covering the Battle of Pharsalus, which saw two juggernauts battle for military supremacy. At stake was the fate of the Roman Republic. In this battle, Caesar would forever etch his name in human history. Julius Caesar had amassed vast wealth, and the loyalty of veteran legions. Most noteworthy was that he was beginning to catch the ire of certain Roman politicians. When Caesar was threatened with imprisonment, he marched on Rome itself. At this time, it was illegal for any Roman army to cross the Rubicon River. Upon crossing, Caesar remarked, "The die is cast," to represent the significance and seriousness of his act. Julius Caesar's abrupt march on Rome forced Pompeian-led Republican forces to retreat across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, where Pompey could count on strong support and muster more legions. To ensure Caesar's forces could not pursue, Pompey gave Publius control of the Republican fleet which dominated the Adriatic Sea. In contrast, Caesar's fleet could not compete with the Republicans' numbers or quality of ships in the Adriatic. This allowed Pompey to flee to Greece with all of his supporters, including Cato the Younger, Brutus, Cassius, and Labienus. In Greece, Pompey was able to muster many more legions with strong support across Greece. Bibulus had strong command over the Adriatic Sea, which made it almost impossible to cross undetected. Nonetheless, Caesar crossed at night, able to get roughly half of his force on a daring night crossing. His presence in Greece was enough to put the Pompeians on alert, but not enough to fully cause a threat. This was due to Pompey's influence on the eastern Roman provinces, especially Greece. There he had a constant, strong supply line, resources, and majority support.
Before Caesar's crossing, he left Mark Antony in charge of the other half of the army with control over most of the Caesar's fleet. Caesar was in a precarious position without the rest of his legions under the control of Antony. With Bibulus controlling the Adriatic, Caesar was effectively cut off from his base of strength in Italy. In Greece, Caesar had fewer legions, no support, and no supply line. As time passed in 49 BCE, Caesar's situation became increasingly more grim. Pompey knew that Caesar was cut off with no resources except for those of conquered cities and his foraging parties. All Pompey had to do was wait for Caesar to run out of resources and deny Caesar the decisive battle he had needed in order to survive. The fate of the Roman civil war hung in the balance. Caesar continued to pressure Antony to make a crossing and meet up with Caesar's forces with more legionnaires and much-needed supplies. Eventually, Antony was able to cross the Adriatic, but not with all of the legionnaires. Regardless, he was able to fight his way and unite with Caesar's forces. Together, they formed a formidable threat to the Republican army because Caesar's forces were grizzled veterans, including the famed 10th Legion. Despite Caesar's threat, Caesar was still at a disadvantage without all of his legionnaires, and the Republican fleet still controlling the Adriatic Sea. In 48 BCE, Caesar and Pompey finally met near the town of Pharsalus. Both stood opposite of each other, with Pompey occupying more favorable, higher ground. Pompey could still wait for Caesar to run out of resources, but Pompey also had to listen to his council. Pompey represented the Republic, not Pompey, although many of the legionnaires had allegiance to Pompey and respected his military career. Pompey's council urged him to fight Caesar because of their numerical advantage, especially in cavalry. Pompey's cavalry outnumbered Caesar's cavalry 7,300 to roughly 1,000 to 2,000. Not only did it outnumber Caesar's cavalry, but it was led by Labienus. Pompey had 1. The high ground, 2. More resources with a stable supply line, and 3. A bigger army with more cavalry. There is no question that Pompey had the advantage going into Pharsalus, but Pompey did not want to risk the entire civil war in one battle when they had so many advantages by not fighting. Pompey knew that giving battle to Caesar would be falling into his trap. As each day passed, Caesar's situation became more precarious. Pompey did not want to give Caesar's veteran legions the chance to snatch victory from a desperate situation like it had on so many prior occasions. However, the other Republican voices in Pompey's camp had their way and forced Pompey into giving Caesar the fight he needed by claiming that their strengths gave them reason to win and bring a swift end to the war. Both armies assembled on the field of Pharsalus directly next to the Enipeus River, with Pompey occupying the north and Caesar on the south. Pompey positioned his left flank next to the river for cover from encirclement. He had newly recruited legionnaires form his center, with the veteran 1st Legion defending his right flank. Labienus commanded. The numeral advantage of Pompey's cavalry was to serve as his strongest weapon. With it, he sought to destroy Caesar's smaller cavalry and encircle Caesar's army. Behind Labienus spread his massive mounted force. The 2,700 long-haired German and Gallic cavalrymen Labienus had brought to Pompey from Caesar's army formed the core. 500 Italian troopers had been brought up from Greece by sea by Gnaeus Pompey. King Diotarus of Galatia had brought Pompey 600 cavalry. The remaining cavalrymen had been supplied by various rulers from throughout the east. The main responsibility for the success lay with Labienus' own men. Caesar placed his army opposite Pompey's army. On Caesar's extreme right, he placed the veteran 10th, 11th, and 12th legions. In the center, he placed the 25th, 26th, and 29th legions under the command of General Domitius. Finally, on his left flank, Caesar placed his remaining legions under the control of Mark Antony. Caesar's generals warned him that Pompey would aim to use the numerically superior cavalry to destroy his right flank. To counter Pompey's cavalry massing on his right, Caesar developed his own 1,000-man cavalry composed of Germans and Gauls supported by auxiliaries. In addition, Caesar created a 4th line that would confront the mass of cavalry after his smaller cavalry were overrun. Caesar ordered, have one cohort taken from each of the legions, and form them into a 4th line, behind the 10th Legion, where they are to await the order to charge the enemy's cavalry. The amount of legionnaires in the 4th line is debatable, but it is estimated the number is around 2,000. These troops were ordered to lay down out of sight and spring up with their javelins to surprise Pompey's numerically superior cavalry. Caesar hoped this unseen 4th line would be able to shatter Pompey's cavalry with their javelins. According to Dando Collins, never before had so many Roman troops faced each other on a single battlefield. Never before had 2 of Rome's greatest generals fought it out like this. Pompey, conqueror of the East, 57, a former young achiever who had made history in his 20s, a multimillionaire, an excellent military organizer, a master strategist, coming off a victory with the larger army. And Caesar, conqueror of the West, who had celebrated his 52nd birthday only 3 weeks before in the month that would eventually bear his name, who had been nearly 40 before he made his first military mark, an original tactician and engineering genius with a mastery of detail, a commander with dash, the common touch, luck, and the smaller but more experienced army. Plutarch lamented on how 70,000 Romans, a force big enough to conquer Parthia or march to India unrivaled, had instead decided on fighting their own brothers. Pompey wanted to achieve a quick end to the battle and avoid possible mishaps from some of his newly recruited legionnaires. Because of this, he deployed his cavalry first. Within seconds, 7,000 horses and riders were charging across the wheat field. In response, Caesar's German and Gallic cavalry lurched forward to meet the Pompeian charge, with their auxiliary light infantry. The Battle of Pharsalus had begun. Infantry on both sides remained where they were unwatched in awe as Pompey's massive cavalry force clashed with Caesar's. As expected, the Pompeian cavalry defeated the much smaller Caesarian cavalry force. Labienus and his horses pushed on, but they were in for an unfortunate and bloody surprise. Upon the sound of trumpets, Caesar's 4th line, surprised, the Germans and Gauls at close quarters, pumping their javelins as instructed, taking out eyes, causing horrific facial injuries and fatalities with every strike. The congested cavalry had come to a dead stop. The panic that was created quickly spread to the allied cavalrymen behind them. Seeing the carnage, the allied riders disengaged from Caesar's cavalry, turned, and galloped from the battlefield, heading in terror for the hills. As Pompey's cavalry was chased from the field, his left flank was completely exposed. The fourth line and Caesar's cavalry turned and crashed into his flank. The only thing stopping Caesar's forces from outflanking Pompey's army were a few thousand archers and slingers. Caesar's forces powered through the archers, who stood their ground bravely, while the slingers ran away. Caesar then sounded for the general charge of his legionnaires. Pompey decided to keep his legions in static formation instead of running to meet the opposing line, as was the standard of the time. Pompey sought to make Caesar's legions run twice the distance while minimizing any disorganization that might be caused by giving his own general order to charge. There was a stalemate on the front line. However, Caesar's right flank began to swing onto the flank and rear of Pompey's First Legion. Pompey knew that if his veteran First Legion could not hold, then none of his legions could. He tried desperately to preserve his flank, but the First Legion broke under the overwhelming pressure. Once Caesar gained the initiative on the right flank, the fight became a rout. Caesar's legions were able to roll up Pompey's legions like a carpet, each legion breaking and retreating one at a time. Pompey retreated to his camp prematurely while contemplating the gravity of the situation. He had all the advantages going into battle, and he knew it, but Caesar had forced the Republicans' hand. Against all odds, Caesar was able to defeat Pompey in the decisive battle he had been seeking for so long. Aftermath. Against the odds, Caesar had defeated the main Republican army. However, Republican senators fled to North Africa and Spain in order to continue the resistance and raise another army to confront Caesar. Unfortunately for Pompey, Pharsalus was his last great battle. Instead of going with his allies in the Senate, he traveled to Egypt instead. He hoped to raise funds and support in Egypt. However, King Ptolemy XIII of Egypt, seeking to gain favor with Caesar's movement, beheaded Pompey, thus ending the great career of one of Rome's greatest generals. Pharsalus remains one of the most important battles in history. It altered the course of Rome and the world forever. Although Caesar had won this massive clash of titans, he would still need to defeat Cato, Labienus, and other Republican resistance. Nonetheless, Pharsalus represented the turning of the tide in the Roman civil war.